Joining me now to talk more about that from a biblical standpoint is the author of The Duke of D.C. We're going to get to that book in a moment. That's a great book, by the way, endorsed by Laura Trump. You want to check it out. Jim Mosley, the Bible history guy with us. Jim, good to see you, sir.
Hi, David. Good to see you as well.
Well, look, mass mandates, we hear so much talk about it, but you have a unique observation as it relates to kind of a biblical fusion, if you will, when it comes to mandates and masks and the Bible, and I'm curious to hear about it, so I'm just going to sit back, relax. I get paid by the minute, as I tell many people, so I don't care. Speak as long as you want. What do I care? I'm collecting money. Just kidding. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, it's amazing when Fauci says what we just heard him say, because they keep telling us to follow the science, but he was actually advocating doing the opposite of following the science. Here you have the vast majority of data tell you one thing, and he's saying, yeah, but if we focus on individual anecdotes, it tells you another thing. Well, that's the opposite of science. You know, I have a ministry called the Bible History Guy, and there are two little sayings that I have, that it is finding faith through facts, and faith is the daughter of doubt. And that's the scientific method. That's how we get to the truth. Jesus said that if we find the truth will set us free. Well, how do you find the truth? You have doubts. And those doubts make you ask questions. And when you ask questions, you find answers. When we went through the pandemic, we couldn't express doubts. We couldn't ask questions. We were deplatformed. We were abused. We were bullied. We lost jobs. We lost friends because we were asking questions. But that is the scientific method. That's how we find out what it really does. And you know, the government really shouldn't be mandating anything about our bodies. Because from a biblical perspective, 1 Thessalonians 4:4 says that we are supposed to, each one of us, take control over our body for holy purposes. And so that means we're supposed to make decisions. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, meaning that God gave us a mind, and he expects us to use that mind. That doesn't mean that authorities are always wrong, but it also means they are often wrong. And, you know, some people will quote Romans 13:1, where Paul says, submit to those in authority. Well, that's true. But Paul wrote that in AD 54 when Nero was just starting his reign. Well, he was a good guy when he was a young emperor. But then he became a homicidal maniac. And he killed Paul, and he killed Peter. And Peter and Paul probably wouldn't have said, well, let's submit to that the moment that he was getting ready to have his head cut off with a sword on Vatican Hill. So we should only be submitting to authorities from a biblical perspective when they are aligned with godly principles. And this whole thing about the pandemic, I mean, God takes care of his biosphere. He created the world, and he created solutions for the problems that we have. Well, guess what? Herd immunity was one of their solutions. There was a huge study done in the Clinical Infectious Diseases Journal that showed that people who had not had the vaccination but had COVID, like me, were 13 times less likely to get the infection again than people who had been vaccinated. That's herd immunity. That's what God does for the world. You know, in other words, we were told to lock down. We were told not to worship. We were told not to go to church. We know the adverse byproducts of lockdowns. There was more drug addiction, domestic abuse, suicide, depression. Well, I think there would have been less of that if we wouldn't have forsaken the fellowship of believers, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of biblical examples. You and I were talking off air about Daniel. I'm curious if you could give that example as well.
Well, okay, so
when it comes to mandates.
Sure, governments all around the world said that churches and religious organizations couldn't meet. Well, that happened to Daniel when he was the number 2 guy in Babylon, and then the Persians took over. And then his enemies in Babylon, who were jealous of him, said, I know what we'll do. We'll go to the new governor of Babylon, and we'll tell him to pass a rule that nobody should worship any god except for him for 30 days. Well, Daniel refused to do that. He continued to worship. And that's what got the 80-year-old Daniel thrown into the lion's den. But the ruler of Babylon was kind of sad about it. He realized he had to do it because he was the one who had done the edict. But when he found that Daniel wasn't destroyed by the lions, the next day he took those officials who had ensnared him into putting Daniel through that ordeal and all their families and threw them into the lion's den, and the lions broke all their bones, destroyed all of them. Yeah. It shows that. What is the example there? Are we supposed to throw government officials into lions' dens? That's not really the point. What the Bible is telling us is that when we rely on God, when we look to him first, he gives us solutions. He rescues us from things like pandemics. I mean, think about the Hebrews in the wilderness when the first generation didn't make it to the promised land. They were afflicted by a plague of venomous serpents. And God told Moses to put a bronze snake on a staff, and so they would look up at that and they would get healed. Well, the snake didn't heal them. It wasn't an idol. It was looking up toward God and remembering his power to heal them that did heal them. And that's why Jesus used himself as that example.
It's just fascinating. Jim, I could talk to you all day about biblical examples of this, or you've got plenty of them. Let me ask you about your book real quick before I let you go. I got a couple minutes here. It's the Duke of D.C. It was endorsed by Laura Trump. Full disclosure, I endorsed it as well. It is fantastic. Can you give people a synopsis? I'm looking at the clock. I got about 2.5 minutes, but give me a synopsis here about why people should be interested in this, especially today, the MAGA audience, the Trump-loving audience, because this has a Trump connection, and even though it's fiction, it's got time travel, it's got comedy, it's got everything. So explain it a little bit.
Well, it's historical fiction, and the hero is really a Trump-like character. He's not Trump because it is a fictional story. But it's very funny. I mean, I have to admit that as many times as I've edited it, whenever I look at it again, I keep on laughing. But it's got a greater point to it. The real concept is, what would happen tomorrow if you woke up and there were no federal government? You might think, a lot of people might think, oh, the safety net would disappear. We couldn't make it. But it turns out, in fact, we have a lot more power in our hands than we think we do. We can survive probably a lot better without many of the things that we spend our tax dollars on. This story's about a guy who gets thrown into jail for going over to look at the January 6th protest, but not doing anything there. But he gets accused of insurrection. And so someone he knows, a researcher, goes to the National Archives and finds an ancient document that shows that he has inherited a deed that was long forgotten, signed by the founders, that gave him the title to Washington, D.C., and gave him a noble title, Duke, which was the only title of nobility ever given to anyone in the United States. And now he finds that he's been jailed by the federal government, but actually he kind of owns it, because this land, he can bring any corporation into his territory, bring anybody into the territory, and make them tax exempt. So he's an offshore tax haven right in the middle of Washington, D.C., and that's where the big battle begins, where the deep state girds its loins and tries to squash him flat, and he has to find out, can he stand up and, just like at Yorktown, once again, turn the world upside down and revive the American dream.
And with fictional references to Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, please give me some of the names in this book, because this cracked me up. Listen to some of these characters. Go ahead, Jim.
We've got the Speaker of the House, Fannie Pelosi. We've got President Beau Hayden. We've got we've got Chuck Boomer, who's the Senate leader. We've got Daisy Katrina Perdue. That's the press secretary. And one of my favorite names is the researcher, Ilsa Guilford Schlitz.
Jim Mosley, the Bible history guy. Where can people go? You have a website? It's thebiblehistoryguy.something.
Yep, just thebiblehistoryguy.com. If you just put the Bible History Guy, you'll find me.
Right. Jim Mosley, great to have you on the show. Thanks so much. When we come back, we've got a lot more to talk about, including Joe Kennedy. The coach, right? Remember he prayed for you?
All right, Jim, you're all clear. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Court, situation with religious liberty. Well, guess what? He's resigned. It happened.